Good morning, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the E3Ed Office of USAID Washington, I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar on distance learning for resilience. This is a part of the Office of Education's Global Education Learning series, and we want to thank our colleague, Joanna Ramos Romero, our lead for professional development, and our colleagues at TRG for their hard work on this event and on the entire series. This morning, we will consider how distance learning can be a tool for resilience. USAID frames resilience as facilitated by a mediating set of conditions, abilities, assets, strategies, networks, and relationships, more simply known as resilience capacities, that help protect learning and well-being outcomes in the face of shocks and stressors. We have an excellent white paper on this topic on Education Links, and we encourage you to read it in full. Today, we will think about the role of distance learning as a sort of resilience capacity. We will think about how distance learning can be a critical, although not the only, element of responding to, recovering from, and building back better from crisis. Crises like COVID-19 perturb, disrupt, and threaten to destroy education systems and opportunities for millions around the world of all ages and all abilities. Distance learning, properly framed and delivered, can play a role in assisting. Our panelists, Sarah and Wafaa from USAID Egypt, Bjorn and colleagues from the EdTech Hub, Kerry Lewis from the Education Development Center, and Rebecca Leahy from WorldReader, all of whom you will hear from shortly, have thought long and hard about the pros and also the cons of distance learning as a tool for resilience. Their interventions this morning will be excellently moderated by Darren and Audrey, our stalwart friends from TRG. And without further ado then, I wish you a warm welcome, and I'll hand it over to Darren, who is our moderator for this morning's session.
Thanks for that introduction, Rebecca, and for setting the stage for today's discussion. As you mentioned, we're joined today by 5 outstanding panelists, and I'm going to briefly introduce each one of them. And in the interest of everyone getting a sense of the common virtual space that we're all forming today, I'm going to ask that each of you, our participants who are watching right now on YouTube Live, and our panelists, share with each other your responses to 2 questions. And those 2 questions are, first, from where in the world are you joining us today? And the second question is, what is one interesting artifact, thing, or item that's in your physical space right now? And so our viewers on YouTube, you can answer that question by typing that response into the chat window. And I see already that some of you have said good morning or good evening and where it is that you're joining us from. But I'm going to give everybody else about 15 seconds right now to answer that question in the chat window. Where are you right now? And what's an interesting artifact or item that's in your physical space? And then I'll turn to our panelists. I'll bring them in on video and they'll answer those same questions as well. So take 15 seconds right now and type your responses into the chat window. All right, great. So I see some of the responses coming in already. We've got folks just scanning here, Netherlands, India, Hong Kong, all over the world. So keep them coming, type in your responses. Where are you right now? And what's something interesting in your space? I'm going to turn now to our panelists, and I'll bring them in on video. First, we have Sarah Banashek, who is the Deputy Director for the Office of Education and Health at USAID Egypt. So Sarah, please turn on your mic and camera, say hello, and tell us where you are and something that's interesting in your space.
Great. Good afternoon, Darren and colleagues. It is the afternoon here in Cairo, Egypt, where I'm joining you from. And something interesting that I have on my desk, of course, I'm coming from Egypt, so I have here a pyramid. And the pyramid is made of alabaster, which is a beautiful stone that you find here in Egypt. And particularly when the light hits the alabaster, it makes for a really, really lovely piece. So that's my artifact from here in Cairo, Egypt. Back to you, Darren.
Thanks, Sarah. Very cool artifact. Second, we're going to turn to Wafaa Al-Adoui, who is a higher education project management specialist, also at the Office of Education and Health at USAID Egypt. So Wafaa, please turn on your mic and camera, say hello, and tell us where you are and something interesting that's in your space.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And I'm talking from Cairo, Egypt. And one thing which is always in my space and always in my hands is my cell phone, which I have to change it to a bigger size because it's always in my hand. And it's nice talking to you this afternoon. Thank you. Back to Darren.
Thanks, Wafaa. Third, we are joined by Rebecca Leagy, who is the Chief Impact Officer at WorldReader. So welcome, Rebecca. Turn on your mic and camera. Where are you? What's something interesting in your space?
Thanks, Darren. Thanks for having us. And it's a pleasure to join all of us around the world that are passionate about this topic. So I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. And from an artifact, I was actually just plugging my son's iPad, which has reminded me that I have become a homeschool parent teacher, which is not my first profession, and both the funds and the challenges of working with my son in his education process.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I feel you on that. Many iPads these days. Fourth, we are joined by Bjorn Hassler, who is the Company Director of Open Development and Education, a founding director at the EdTech Hub, and a visiting researcher at the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. So Bjorn, where are you and what's something interesting in your space?
Hello, everyone. I'm based in London, in Greater London at the moment, which unfortunately is a place where race relations have also come into the limelight with recent news, if you've seen it, but there we are. So saying hi from London. One of the things that's in my space is this KaiOS phone, which is a feature phone, no touch screen. But it has a very long battery life. It takes 2 SIM cards and it runs WhatsApp and different apps. So this is a really interesting kind of new option for technology in low income and rural settings.
Awesome. Thank you, Bjorn. And then fifth, we are joined by Kerry Lewis, Senior Project Director at Education Development Center. So Kerry, please turn on your mic and camera, say hello. Where are you and what's something interesting in your space?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Nice to be able to join you all. I'm coming to you from Silver Spring, Maryland, in the United States, where it's morning here. And in my space, I don't have them on right now, but I keep these risers for my laptop because my laptop is usually running for many, many hours a day and just making sure it's well ventilated and not overheating. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. So welcome again to all of you and welcome to all of our viewers on YouTube and for sharing all of your cool artifacts. So we're going to jump right into the discussion and to questions from all of you. So here's how that's going to work. We're aiming to explore 6 topics today when it comes to distance learning as a tool for system resilience. The first topic is around adaptation and flexibility. We're also going to look at distance learning and inclusivity. The third topic we're going to look at is distance learning and higher education. The fourth we'll explore is professional development for teachers. The fifth is technology for building skills. And the sixth is evidence and resilience. So those are the 6 topics that we're going to kind of structure this discussion around. And as we move from topic to topic in the discussion, I'm going to invite all of you, our viewers watching on YouTube, at various moments to type questions that you have related to the topic that's being discussed at that moment. That's going to allow me, that's going to allow us to weave in your questions into the discussion as seamlessly as possible. So for example, our first topic of discussion is on the flexibility and adaptability of distance learning. So if you have any questions related to that topic of flexibility and adaptability, please start typing those questions into the chat window right now. I'll ask a couple of our panelists to discuss this topic, and then we're going to turn to maybe a question or two that came in the chat window. So again, if you have questions on that topic right now, start typing them in the chat window, and then I'll invite you all, as again, we move on to the next topic, I'll ask you all to type questions that are related to that topic, so on and so forth. So don't be shy. We want to get as many questions as possible. Any questions that we are not able to answer during this discussion, we're going to save them, and when a recording of this is made available on edulinks.org, our panelists will be able to respond to some of those questions in written form. So again, don't be shy. Just ask your questions in the text. And for tech issues, this is the world we live in. If you have issues seeing the YouTube live, just check your internet connection. Try the link again. There shouldn't be any issues with your microphone or camera because this is just a viewing experience for you with the chat window. So hopefully you won't experience any technical issues. So let's jump right into it with our first topic on adaptation and flexibility. So distance learning is not new. However, in the midst of a global pandemic, it has become a required mode of learning and teaching that some education systems may have been prepared to leverage, while others have had to scramble to figure out how to do that well. It's forced education systems to be more flexible and to adapt their approaches to this new reality. And this may, in fact, provide an avenue to build a more resilient education system. So I want to turn first to Kerry from Education Development Center. We're going to start with you. How can distance learning be leveraged to achieve greater flexibility and adaptability? So go ahead, turn on your camera and mic and take it away.
Yeah, so I think it's really about design and scale. So it's important to design with adaptability in mind. At EDC, we were able to pivot our distance learning solutions to be used at home with families during this COVID crisis because it's designed for low resource settings, and that makes it much more adaptable. There are no assumptions that certain preconditions will exist in order to use the IAI programs. The assumption is that there will be a method for diffusion. There'll be a facilitator who may or may not be trained, and then there'll be an audience. So there are no assumptions made during design, and this allows it to be adaptable to many different contexts. Maybe, Darren, you can put up the picture from Zambia. It's important to design it so it's an all-inclusive package. The fewer parts that are necessary, the more likely it'll survive challenges. So an example would be delivering the broadcast medium, like a radio, with a content, and that might be a USB key, with a power supply, say solar panels. And so what they're receiving is the entire package, and they don't have to go looking for other pieces to make things work. And that truly makes it adaptable. And the second thing is scale. So customization is definitely the gold standard, but while that might be desired by the ministries, desired by funders, we definitely prefer to do a customized product. There are economies of scale that are available. So my advice would be that when producing programs, think on a larger scale. Can these programs be easily adapted to a different country or a different setting? And this is what we did with our ELA programs, our English for Latin America. During the design process, we were thinking about how this could be used in the region, even though they were being developed for a particular country. And then finally, work with ministries and donors to see the benefits of that flexibility in terms of already produced programming. It's not perfect, but programming that's already produced is much better than no programming at all.
Great, thanks, Kerry. And Bjorn, let's turn to you. What about you? Same question. How can distance learning be leveraged to achieve greater flexibility and adaptability?
Yeah, I do think it's a really interesting question. Let me take a slight step back with this and say, when we talk about, we've already heard this from Kerry just now, but when we talk about flexibility and adaptability in distance learning, what do we mean, right? So are we just replacing talk and chalk by some kind of online mode? Then we're not achieving any progress, let alone greater flexibility and adaptability. So I think there's an opportunity here to disrupt outdated pedagogies if we do it right. So let's move from talk and chalk, but I don't necessarily mean in higher education, I mean in primary and secondary, from talk and chalk to more engaging pedagogies. If you want to bring up the first picture in the background. So how do we enable this flexibility? Well, we need to look at multimodal approaches. We need to look at learning in social distance schools. We need to look at learning at home. We need to look at learning in small groups, learning on your own. And so there isn't a one size fits all. I think the flexibility and adaptability and ultimately the resilience really comes from embracing a multimodal approach. And what we see in this figure here is a sort of a schematic that comes from one of the EdTech Hub reports on a response to the COVID learning crisis, which is to really look at what devices are available. I won't go into the diagram, we'll share the reference later on, but it's really to look at what does the population at hand have, what do the most disadvantaged children have, what do different demographic segments have access to, printed books, radio, television, maybe some smartphones, probably much more non-smartphones, very few laptops, and so forth. And so we really need to embrace the availability, the affordances of these devices, and then build our pedagogies around that with these different multimodal approaches. When I say this, I speak primarily about primary and secondary education. And while the demographic is different in higher education, very similar thinking, in my view, would apply to higher education as well.
Great, thank you, Bjorn. And again, if you've got any questions in the audience about adapting and flexibility of distance learning, please go ahead and type those in the chat window, and we can weave those into the conversation. Let's move on to our second topic, which looks at inclusivity. And again, at this point, if you've got any questions on distance learning and inclusivity, how to make it more inclusive, what inclusion looks like in a distance learning space, if you've got questions about that, please put those in the chat window right now. We'd love to bring your questions into the conversation. So inclusive education is a priority in the USAID education policy. The policy states that, quote, our investments and advocacy should reinforce laws, policies, and procedures that promote equitable access to quality education, the inclusion of children and youth with disabilities, and gender equality in education at the regional, national, and local levels, end quote. And later it states that, quote, by not programming intentionally for children and youth with disabilities, we risk excluding a significant share of the population from acquiring the skills needed to live a productive life, end quote. So I'm gonna ask Rebecca Leahy from WorldReader, and again, turn to Kerry from EDC to weigh in on this topic. And again, I invite you all watching on YouTube to start typing your questions on this topic into the chat window. So Rebecca, how can distance learning contribute to building a more inclusive system?
Thanks, Darren. I mean, for sure, this global pandemic has shed light on the inequalities that we see. And it also inequalities both from the technology access, the social economic, the divide between urban and rural, but I think it's also giving us an opportunity to rethink how we actually make and build back better in a more inclusive environment. I can think of three examples that would resonate for all of us to contemplate about around inclusivity, and that is we all learn differently. We have multiple intelligence, multiple learning modalities we need to apply with our students and with our own children. And so when we think of building back better, we can then use this as an opportunity both from a pedagogical standpoint, a professional development standpoint, to help teachers innovate as they're dealing much more on a one-to-one or in smaller group settings from that distant learning perspective. It's also an opportunity as we look at the broader education system to recognize the role of parents, recognizing parents are also now becoming a teacher or a component of the education system. Whether it's a parent, a caregiver, or an older sibling, they are having to play a larger role of the education process for someone younger. So from a WorldReader perspective, we're very committed to working with families in order to engage them in a reading process that allows them to use reading a book as a tool to develop broader skills that we know are so critical. Darren, if you could show that picture of a mother and child reading together. They're reading a book here in India. It's called Satay's Boat. And in terms of actually reading, then it gives the opportunity for the mother to say, let's do some activities around. It could be an older sister or brother that's actually reading, or a father. But we have an activity that they read Satay's Boat, they work with a piece of paper, they make a boat, and it helps with a young child's fine motor skills at the same time, while developing bonds, but also giving an educational opportunity. The second example, thanks Darren for showing that. The second example I'd say is really around the type of technology. Bjorn held up a KaiOS phone. If you're not familiar with KaiOS, it's a new operating system that is being used throughout sub-Saharan Africa as well as in India. WorldReader's BookSmart platform works on it. We recognize that in order to address distant learning, you need to actually build technology that can be used online and offline, that is affordable, that is an opportunity to be used, I would say, to bring the private sector into the conversation. A lot of the inequalities have been data is expensive or unavailable. And so if we can work as an education sector to bring private sector engagement into this process, I think education systems have a unique opportunity at this time to leverage both the private sector as well as to enable many communities to develop 21st century skills in this. In Ghana, for example, Vodafone and MTN have zero-rated our app, BookSmart, so that people can read without any concern for their data cost. As we know, data is very precious and being used for so many apps right now as the main way of communication. And I guess the third example I'd say is that technology, from an inclusive standpoint, we have struggled for many years to track and trace books into the school, into the hands of learners. And we've become much more successful than we have over the last number of years in that process of getting hard textbooks into the hands or the supplemental reading. But digital can expand that. It can complement it, and it can offer hundreds more into communities, into households where they may not have actually had a book. We recently were working with Concern Worldwide in Kenya on a radio program, and a child had downloaded a book, and they realized that it was the first time they had actually read a full book. They'd read off our platform, they'd heard the radio message and the learning, and then to have had that sense of accomplishment that they actually had a book themselves in their hands and they had read it is, I think, a very powerful message for distance learning and technology and the inclusivity that it brings. Thanks, Darren.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And Kerry, let's turn to you. What are some other ways to view and practice distance learning through an inclusivity lens?
Mm-hmm. Well, the inclusivity question is a great question, especially for these times. And I think that the answer centers around intention. So, as you're building programs, get to know your target audience, and among them, find out who is most marginalized, gather data. Who has access and what are their completion rates? What are the barriers to learning? So that you can develop relevant, targeted strategies for learning and integrate those solutions, or at least, if not solutions, modifiers to problems during the design of your content. And then intentionally model marginalized groups in a positive light. Model them as the problem solvers, as the bearers of knowledge. With interactive audio, we work with a system of characters and setting, and so we're intentional about choosing characters that might be marginalized, or choosing settings that are not the go-to, that are not seen as the center of knowledge and power, and using those positively. Then, finally, guide your users, provide your users with explicit strategies for including and meeting the needs of traditionally excluded groups. And then I think Rebecca and Bjorn touched on this, multi-channel learning or a mixed media approach is a great way to access populations, different populations. There's radio, whether it's broadcast or it's pre-recorded. You can have online, digital, offline, like our Stepping Stone, that provides a lot of the rich media content that you can get online. You can have phone, you can have an app correspondence, and that allows different parts of your population to access your content, but it also provides some sort of variety and an entertaining quality to your content. And that variety really is the hallmark of good distance education programs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kerry. And so we have a question from the audience. This one comes from Claire Hanbury, and maybe Rebecca Leahy from WorldReader, you could take this question. Claire asks, are there other examples of distance learning where the children reached are also urged to seek out children who may struggle to get access to that learning and then pass on that learning or be mentors?
Thank you for the question. What we have seen is that there have been some young girls, such as Achievers Ghana, who have actually formed some reading groups with younger children that they're passing on. So they have taken stories, they've then gone out and been kind of reading mentors to younger children, if that's an example. We've also seen this in Kenya through some radio programming that has been done where there's been the radio lessons, some encouragement to do some reading, and then the older youth, those that have some literacy experience, are using a phone to share and read, and then actually have like a reading club with those in their extended family or neighbors.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Claire, for your question. Let's move on to topic 3, that's with higher education. And so a lot of attention has been given to distance learning at the basic education level, but what about higher education? USAID Egypt has a lot of experience and lessons we can learn from. So I'm going to turn to Sarah Banashek and Wafaa Al-Adwi for their perspectives on this topic. And I now invite you all, our viewers, to type in any questions you have about distance learning and higher education. Type those into the chat window and we can weave them into the discussion. So like I said, I'd like to turn now to Sarah and Wafaa for us to hear about their experience in the realm of distance learning at the higher education level. How are students accessing online career counseling? And what kind of training have the counselors received in order to best provide guidance to those students? And I know that both of you also have some great images that you'd like me to share, so just let me know when you want me to bring those up. So Sarah, why don't you start?
Great. Thanks so much, Darren. It's from here in Egypt and in the higher education space. My colleague Wafaa and I are really excited to be here to tell you about how our career centers have helped to build resilience into the system at Egyptian public universities, affecting nearly 3 million students. But first, I want to just set the stage a little bit to tell you how they got started. And it's a classic story where we've heard time and again from employers in Egypt who say they have jobs, but they don't have applicants that are qualified for them. And on the other hand, we've heard from students, they say they want to work, but they cannot find jobs. And so that's why we have been working here to bridge this gap between the students at the universities on the one hand and the private sector employers on the other. And we've worked with an excellent implementing partner, the American University in Cairo, to bridge this gap through the establishment of 15 career centers in 10 Egyptian public universities. And Darren, I think if you would like to show a couple of the pictures now, it'll give our audience a sense of what the centers look like and to preview a bit how they have adapted. So today we are really changing the status quo by bridging the gap between universities on the one hand and employers on the other. And to date, we have reached more than 90,000 students and provided over 4,500 job and internship opportunities. And this is all great, but as with any system, the real test of its strength and sustainability, and I'm going to quote our excellent moderator, Rebecca Rhodes, it's resilience capacity is what happens when it experiences a shock. And as we all know, COVID-19 was the shock this year. And in mid-March here in Egypt, all of our university campuses were shuttered with virtually no contingency plans. So we are really proud to say that our career centers did not let these campus closures slow them down. And in fact, they used distance learning as a tool to strengthen system resilience. They embraced online modalities to work with existing clients, but they also even expanded their reach by many-fold. For example, since March, an additional 10,000 students have benefited from virtual career counseling and online classes. And to quote back to the earlier question on inclusivity, we've also adapted our career centers to help students in rural and remote parts of the country without internet connectivity get access. And so whether these are online or in person, we found that our career centers are a system that is sustainable. And from what we've seen in a COVID-19 adaptation, they are resilient. They've changed the way that students think and help to develop skills that employers value. But before I go too far into the story, I'm actually going to pass it to my colleague, Miss Wafaa El-Adawi, and she's going to tell you a bit more. So Wafaa, you want to turn on your camera and your mic? Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to talk about the Career Center's activity. And as Sarah mentioned, currently we have 15 career centers at 10 public universities in Egypt. So each of these centers are offering different courses to the students in their final years. We have leadership courses, entrepreneurship, employability skills, as you have seen in the photos that Darren had kindly put them. So in the employability skills training, we provide them with resume writing, techniques for presentation and for interviews. So also all these kinds of courses, also we offer them business English. In this kind of courses, we not only build their capacity to join the job market, but we help them to develop what is problem solving, the critical thinking. All this all happens through interactive methodologies. To answer the second questions of the career advisors who help the students, in each center, the career advisors also, the students have the opportunity to have one-on-one career guidance and career planning with our career advisors. So the career advisors having an intensive training through a curriculum. The curriculum is under the National Career Development Association in the US. So they receive such a training curriculum. They also receive on-the-job coaching through an intensive coaching by certified career development global instructors. So all this kind of training that they receive to be a very well-trained advisors, career advisors, this process takes between 12 to 18 months. But this intensive training is actually what helped system resilience as career advisors move to distance learning in last March. And I'm giving it over to Darren. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Wafaa and Sarah, for those great examples. So we have a question from the audience. This is from Paul Prinsolu from the University of South Africa. And Paul asks, any experience in how to deal with emergency summative assessment at scale? So 14,000 students in a course, for example, during COVID without proctoring. Sarah or Wafaa or maybe Bjorn might have some thoughts on this, but Sarah, why don't we turn to you to answer this question?
Wow, I wish I did have the answer. This is honestly the $64,000 question, as we say in the United States. It's a huge challenge. As I mentioned, here in Egypt, we have over 3 million students in our public universities alone. Egypt is the most populous nation in the Middle East and North Africa region. So right now, we are currently grappling with this question as we speak, together with our Ministry of Higher Education counterparts, trying to find out, what are ways that students can be assessed in a way that's genuine, in a way that actually, moves the needle, if you will, on their academic skills. I know on the basic education side here in Egypt, one of the ways in which the Ministry of Education, we have two ministries here, the Ministry of Education adapted was they had students do self-directed research projects, which they submitted using Edmodo, an online platform. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Wafaa, to see if she has more to say on this topic. Wafaa, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Also, during this time, which is very hard, there's a lot of challenges that we face, but the career centers inside the public universities are helping not only to the students for the capacity building, but we are also helping the staff as well, because all the career advisors that are working at the career centers are staff, faculty members. So we are helping them through this time for their capacity building and helping them for assessing the situation. So during our online courses, we are engaging also the other faculty members during our online courses, and engaging them is part of, we are helping them for the distance learning as well, and to get used to the distance learning capacity building. That's just for me now. Thank you. I'm passing it to Darren.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Wafaa, and thank you, Paul, for your question. Let's move on to our fourth topic that looks at professional development. And so teachers around the world, they've had to pivot to a completely different style, mode, and approach to teaching, all of which requires, in many cases, new tools and skills to do it well. So I'd like Bjorn to touch on this issue. And then again, I invite you all watching on YouTube right now to type in any questions you have on this topic of professional development for distance learning. So Bjorn, I'd like to ask you, what kind of professional development is possible for teachers and faculty to receive or to adapt their curriculum or course content to online learning and teaching?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And I want to sort of throw the question slightly back on you, because I do think the question is very, very contextually dependent. For higher education, lecturers and tutors have more facilities. I'm not saying it's straightforward, but HE is a privilege to an extent, and there's comparative advantages. I want to talk more about primary and secondary school teachers, especially in low-income countries, which is a significant concern. So let's focus on that. Now, when I look at the question, is the focus about adapting the curriculum for online learning and teaching? Is that the right focus? Is a curriculum that's suitable for online learning actually what's needed? Is there a new normal there? Or is it actually that we need blended approaches anyway? We need multimodal approaches. Children are in school, they're not learning. Is it about a new curriculum, or is it about just thinking about how the current curriculum can actually be taught in more engaging ways that take, of course, account of the COVID crisis? But multimodal approaches, different teaching strategies, that's true before COVID, and it's now also true during COVID. Now, the second question is, when we say that teachers and faculty should adapt their curriculum. Now, with faculty, and let's say that's higher education, maybe. I think teachers in primary and secondary, no. Teachers in primary and secondary, even in the UK, do not write their own curriculum. It's completely unfair to expect teachers to adapt the curriculum in some way. That's not the role of the teacher. The teacher needs to have their pastoral care towards the children. They need to be able to teach the curriculum effectively. They need to be able to micro-adapt the curriculum to the learning situation at hand, to the children at hand. But actually, It's not their role to adapt the curriculum overall. So what is it then that professional learning for teachers might do here, right? If you show the first image from the Education Endowment Foundation, I think this is really about let's get children learning. What is it that the teacher should be doing in the classroom? So when we look at the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit, which is the next image, So you can look at this on the web. If you Google EEF toolkit, you'll find it, and you see here that teachers giving better feedback to students, self-regulation, metacognition, reading comprehension, mastery learning, oral language interventions, getting children talking, peer tutoring. Those are all of the things that get children learning. There's solid evidence there that this is what actually helps children learn. We can't just ditch this and say, oh, well, we'll do it online. And I'll say in a minute why. Now, let's look at these things. Now, obviously, the direct feedback from the teacher to the student is harder. But self-regulation, that seems to be completely possible if we do it in the right way, right? Peer tutoring from other students, if there's social distancing, maybe not. Peer tutoring within the family unit, that's totally possible, right? So I think there are these kind of, pre-COVID insights, they're just as valid. We just need to think about how to tweak them rather than saying, well, this all goes out the window, let's have a new normal. Can we have the next image? So here's the thing that's worrying about this, right? So you've seen homework in secondary, which is reasonably effective. Now on this image, we have a bit from the bottom of this table, which is organized by impact. I know I'm glossing slightly over this, but have a look at it. It's very, very instructive. We'll see on the next image that homework in primary actually has a fairly low impact on student learning, right? So to the extent that, the COVID interventions that we're planning are of a kind of homework type nature, they're not going to be impactful, right? And so, what do we have to do? Well, we really have to look at the pedagogies that are effective, like bringing about better peer tutoring, mastery learning, that kind of thing, collaborative learning, to make sure that children have an opportunity to learn and think about how to do this in the COVID setting. So what does that mean for teacher professional development, right? So this is where we want to get to. How do we now need to structure teacher professional development so that teachers are actually more empowered to promote this kind of learning during COVID? So firstly, the general adage, the general insight is, well, teachers need to have access to PD and they need to have access to professional development that is actually effective, right? How do teachers learn? Teachers learn through practicing. Teachers learn through plan, teach, reflect, through having a stimulus and then planning, teaching, and reflecting. Do teachers really learn through distance learning? My view is that they aren't. The most inspired teachers will, because they know that they can turn this into practice. Your average teacher that's really struggling, has no electricity, has no running water, their salary is not being paid, it's like they're not going to learn online. I honestly think, let's get real, they're not going to go online. So we have to find other ways in which we can make PD effective. And what's the thing there, right? So we know that cascade models don't work, but we do know that school-based teacher professional development approaches can work. You can build communities of practice in schools, and actually you can build those against the odds. You can build those among teachers that otherwise don't have a lot of resources at their disposal, because there is a reinforcing pattern within the school that will bring all the teachers on board. Now, this isn't going to work in every single school. There are many schools that are so run down where that might not work, but actually from the research that we've done, from the evidence, actually it works in a surprising number of schools. Because we're taking those teachers seriously and we're saying, look, you're in really poor circumstances, it's really terrible. This doesn't make you a bad teacher. You can still have professional pride, you can still be motivated to work. So I think there are these kind of school-based patterns of professional development that can really work, and we'll circulate some of the literature on this and some of the sort of reports that we've written on this. Now, and finally, how do we change the content of this professional development? Of course, the professional development cannot be for the classroom situation, right? The teacher is probably one of the few government agents that semi-rural and deep rural areas and could do something about the learning of the children. So the professional development has to focus on the things that are possible for the teacher, supporting children learning at home, talking to parents and saying, look, we know that talk is really important. Get your child to talk in whatever way you can. Get your children talking. What did you do outside just now? What did you do yesterday? Ask your child, if your child is doing interactive radio, what did you learn today? Was it easy? So there are simple things, almost formulaic things that I think teachers could stimulate parents to do that would actually have a good impact on learning. Now, I know this is hard, right? Everybody in deep rural areas is already struggling. This is hard, but I don't really see another solution. I don't think technology is a solution. So I think if we have a chance of doing something, then it's promoting, in these new modes of teachers playing more of a community role. It's not about pedagogies for online and distance learning. We're so far away from getting the technologies in. It really means looking at what's there, as we saw in the earlier spider diagram, looking at TV, radio, interactive radio, printing materials. How can teachers stimulate the use of those materials, make sure that they're used, especially for the most vulnerable children? And I think this is actually a model that gives more agency. It's a more distributed model, right? So it might be one that's harder to monitor, but I actually think it's a fundamentally resilient model, empowering teachers as professionals, empowering parents. That's going to be very hard to take away. Once you've achieved that, that's going to give you quite a resilient workforce that is then hard to take away again.
That's great. Thanks, Bjorn, for those insights. And we have a question from the audience, or we may have one coming in a little bit. But let's move on now. We've got two more topics to discuss. We've got about 15 minutes left. Two more topics and then some concluding statements. So we'll move it along to technology and skill building. And this is somewhat related to the previous topic of professional development that focused on how distance learning technology or not, as Bjorn pointed out, to skill building. And so I'd like Kerry and Rebecca to explore this one for us. And again, I invite you all watching on YouTube to type any questions you have on this topic of technology for building skills, and you can type those into the chat window now. But Kerry, let's start with you. How does technology used in distance learning support building skills? And let me know if you'd like me to bring up some of the other images from your work.
Sure. As a matter of fact, yeah, you can bring up some of the pictures just so we can get a sense of what interactive audio looks like. I like this question. I particularly like it because interactive audio instruction is built to support foundational skills. What the technology does is that it gives opportunities for iterative practice. And it removes assumptions about not having enough time or learners uninterested in revisiting material. When you think of digital media for learning, there's an opportunity to really build child-centered learning where the learner is making decisions about the number of times to revisit exercises. And I'm thinking specifically about tablet-based learning content. And we know that it's really important, especially for young learners, that they need to be able to revisit material multiple times. It's also true for teachers. Each time they revisit the material, they're learning something new. I mean, if you've ever done a fingerprint, whether it's a digital fingerprint recognition or even an ink and paper, when you press your finger to the screen or to the paper, you have to kind of press each time and more of the fingerprint appears. Whether if you're using ink, you have to roll your finger around. It starts with some lines and then your fingerprint. With each time, you're getting a bigger or better picture, a clearer picture of your fingerprint. And it's the same thing with young learners. They need to come back multiple times and revisit the materials. And so that they can build better and stronger associations. And the technology offers that in a way that's non-judgmental. Now, when you think about resiliency, Rebecca offered that wonderful definition at the top. It's about building those set of experiences that give the possibility to resist challenges and shocks. It gives learners a chance to see themselves in a positive learning situation so that when they do encounter a difficult situation, they have built up the character tools to see themselves through it. It also, the technology also is helpful for the teacher in a way that it assists with time on task, truly using time efficiently, ensuring that the teacher revisits foundational skills periodically while introducing new skills. And it also is a great tool for modeling good questioning techniques or other good teaching skills. Once just a little short story, once I was visiting some schools with a colleague, this was in Zambia, and we were out visiting, we were on the road, and he said, well, over there, behind that mountain, there's one of our schools. And I said, well, yeah, let's go and visit. And he said, no, we can't visit it, because there are elephants crossing. And he said, even if we could, we'd have to call a ranger, and the ranger would have to come. And even if we had the ranger, if the elephants came, we might have to sit in the car overnight because we can't move until they move. And so what opportunity does that school or those set of schools behind the mountain have? And if it were not for the technology, and the technology provides that. And so whether it's elephants or a river or a road or a global pandemic, the technology offers that opportunity to get to those most far-flung places that don't normally have access to learning. The technology is the platform, it's the vehicle. It's not the teacher and it's not the content, but it does amplify and expand in an equitable way access to education.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kerry. I'd like to turn this now to Rebecca. Rebecca, your work with WorldReader and previously with the All Children Reading Global Initiative has really put you at the center of reading, literacy, and technology. So tell us more about how technology in the distance learning space has been supporting skill building.
Great, thank you. Technology is a vehicle, as Kerry said, particularly around resilience. Not resistance, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, but around resilience. I would say in terms of just carrying on from the professional development strand of question, there is really, if we're going to build resilience, it's also within the family. And Bjorn spoke a little bit to it, Kerry did as well. In terms of really supporting that family unit, the parents, the caregivers, because they are now part and parcel of the education system in a way that they haven't been before. But technology, as we have seen over many years, does allow the ability to, as Kerry said, revisit texts, revisit learning concepts that may have been not available before, and to be able to drill down on it. When I think of digital reading and my experience with All Children Reading and now at WorldReader, digital reading for me is a passion of mine, but also I believe a vehicle that complements a lot of the good work that is happening in other areas. It increases the amount of text, right, that children and vocabulary that they need to develop that foundational learning experience. And the more exposure to text we know that children have, the more likely they are to succeed in their literacy acquisition. It also helps for children that are struggling readers or that they're visually impaired in some way, that you can begin to expand text, you can highlight text, you can bring it to life for some struggling readers, for creativity for children that are wanting to explore language in a new way. I would say it also looks at an opportunity in which you can begin to embed. You can embed audio for those that would like to listen and hear how pronunciation work. You can embed dictionaries so that children very easily can tap on a word and learn the meaning, further expanding their vocabulary and their world through words. WorldReader has been working in Uganda with about 5 different schools with children with visual disabilities. And they're really recognizing that having a tablet that works offline with a wide variety of text that can be made either available through audio or by enlarging the print has really enabled them to develop much more of a habit of reading and to empower these students that had never before had this experience of actually being active readers within their own classroom setting. So I think technology, as Kerry said, is not the be-all and end-all, as we all know on this phone call, but it is a very valuable tool. And the tool that is probably the most valuable is the mobile phone that's sitting in each of our pockets, is sitting in the hands of at least one parent. There are very few communities that have no phone at all, whether it's a feature phone. So the more that we can build to that, technologies that reach even those that are on feature phones, as we shared earlier, I think we're actually going to be able to bridge some of this technology divide that we're seeing acutely aware of today.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. And I know Sarah and Wafaa, you also have some thoughts on this as technology for building skills. And just want to remind you, let's touch on these briefly in our last topic in our last 5 minutes, because I want to hand it over to Rebecca Rhodes for some of key messages for us to walk away with. But turn now to Sarah and Wafaa if you have any thoughts on this question around technology and skill building.
Thanks so much, Darren. Actually, it's Wafaa that's going to take this one. So Wafaa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Actually, I'm going to take the last thing that Rebecca mentioned, which is technology is a valuable tool, because actually this is what we found out. And during we moved the career centers shifted to the online courses, and when it was very hard to reach our students that they are not on campus anymore. So we relied heavily on our Facebook pages for each center to reach out and announce for our online courses through our Facebook pages. And this was a great tool for the students to sign up and to do all the registration process through the Facebook pages. I actually know that for the sake of the time, but I want going to mention one of the tools that we took from the career centers, which is the job shadowing. We partnered with, and if Darren can kindly put the Titan photo, this is a cement company that one of the career centers partnered with it to give 2 days of job shadowing to the students. So it was very important, and the students were able to experience for 2 days job shadowing. Another tool that the career centers are working on now is having a virtual career fair. So there is a lot of examples that I can share. Also, the career Zoom is one of the tools that the career centers are using now, which having information sessions that the employers can come and talk about how they are coping with COVID-19 and what kind of new skills that they are looking for in their candidates. I need to stop here because of the time, but there are many examples that I can share of how the career centers can adapt distance learning to build system resilience despite all the challenges of COVID-19. Thank you, and over to Darren.
Great, thank you, Wafaa, for that. So we have our last topic looks at evidence and resilience. So I'll ask Rebecca, Ligi, and Bjorn, again, just brief comments on this, and then we'll hand it over to Rebecca Rhodes for some closing statements. So Rebecca, we'll start with you. What are the best ways to acquire evidence that will help weave in distance learning as a long-term element of a larger system so that it can support resilience?
Thanks, Darren. I mean, I think there's several things that we need to immediately work on, and I'm sure some have begun, but we need to do some qualitative research to understand what isn't working already in our efforts in rapid response to this global pandemic. We need to look at some of the pedagogical training and modalities that have been done from more of a quantitative perspective. But I think probably some of the most valuable research that could be done right now is what is being collected and harnessed through mobile technology. So from a WorldReader perspective, the phrase, if we haven't collected the data or measured it, it hasn't happened. And I think what is equally important right now is what is not happening. So part of our methodology in looking at our data is we track how many books have been read, when they've been read, the frequency, the time and depth of the book, like how much engagement there has been in the book. But it also tells us who's not reading, right? So much of the work that we've done is we believe it's happening or we really wish it to happen. And then we're often faced with reality that it hasn't happened. And so actually knowing what isn't happening right now is going to be just as valuable in our research as we go forward, so that we can continue to improve and iterate, because this is a unique opportunity we have as a international industry, right? The international education sector to come together and understand the principles that Bjorn expressed. How do they need to shift and moderate and be modified as we go forward? And we'll also learn it both from what is happening and what is not happening.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And in the interest of time, we're going to move right on to Rebecca Rhodes for some concluding statements. So what are some key messages, Rebecca Rhodes, that you've taken away from this discussion? And I also ask all of our viewers on YouTube, as Rebecca's walking through some of these key messages that she's drawn from today's discussion, I ask you all to actually type into the chat window what has been the biggest takeaway for you from this discussion, and we'll compile Rebecca's takeaways and key messages with yours, and that will be part of something that we share on edulinks.org as part of this recording. So Rebecca, I turn it over to you, and just let me know when you want me to bring up the slides.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. That's great. Appreciate it. I think bringing up the slides would be great. I did quickly want to answer one question I saw come through from Leo about building in distance learning planning into national education systems at national scale for all the future shocks and stressors and pandemics that we know may come our way. And I did want to really draw attention to that question, because I think it is important, even when you're using, as some on the webinar, as Kerry mentioned, what is available now today, it is important to think about that long-term planning, about that long-term budgeting, and about that long-term data collection with your country, your host country, or your country counterparts, because there will always be some students somewhere who could benefit from some application of distance learning. And so we take the perspective that it should be a part of the ecosystem no matter what, and a functioning part and a strong part. And so it's not too soon to look at what has a given country or what has a given region or state government reserved for budgeting for this, and how can the data and the knowledge of the territory and the learners be used to frame a good response. So I did want to draw attention to that question. But in terms of key messages and takeaways, very quickly, because we are at time, I think we've heard very strongly, starting with Bjorn, but then echoed throughout, a need to rethink how we deliver education. That's the lesson of these shocks and stressors and crises. We really have to rethink what we're doing and how. It's time to explore different modalities, tools, and systems to make multimodal, multi-layered approaches if we can, and to really promote resilience by moving away from pedagogies and structures that are very singular in their focus, that come from these older models of sort of the Prussian military school, and that open up the possibilities for a wide range of learners with a wide range of abilities. I think we've heard that it's very important, Rebecca Leahy was strong on this point, to reverse these long-standing inequities in systems by really closing the materials gap. Materials are not everything in a system, it's not everything in education, but distance learning, sans any material at all, is probably not going to achieve the outcomes that are hoped for. So resilience can be built by finding these technologies and these delivery systems and these approaches that produce access to multiple types of learning resources via, hopefully, a single simple tool. And I think Rebecca Leahy gave a great example, both through the mobile telephone idea and through the idea of using tablets to do this. I think we heard very strongly from Kerry and others that we need to be designing our distance learning modalities with less is more as our mantra. The fewer parts that a technology has, or the more low resource that a solution may be, the easier it will be to adapt that and use it in different contexts. And I personally know from my own career experience, but many know that radio is a great example of this, as are simple audio applications. Simplicity enhances resilience. If it's too complex, it won't sustain. Resilience, we've learned, will also increase if distance learning goes beyond merely recreating traditional classrooms and branches out to other types of learning experiences that a given population may need or require. And I think both Sarah and Wafaa from Egypt were able to really show how distance learning can move beyond just the content of a textbook and become very hands-on. In their case, it became about workforce skills. It became about building connections to networks. And this is really an expanded definition of what we use distance learning for, that we should explore and grow in our practices, especially as we try to use distance learning across the range of learners and their different age groups. And then I think we've heard very strongly throughout that really, in and amongst all of this, it's caring and supportive systems that best build and demonstrate great levels of resilience. So whatever you are doing, whatever modality you're exploring or whatever application you're trying, you do have to focus your efforts first and foremost on building human connection between who's ever in the learning role and whoever is in the teaching role in any given distance learning format. It's that human connection and that sense of joining in a conversation, as we've tried to do today, that will actually enhance the learning and build a groundwork and a basis for it. So expanding from that base of connection to then think about how will you build and measure skills or content mastery, I think is probably the key to moving down the road towards using distance learning for resilience. So with that, I know we're a bit over time, but it's been a great and informative morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank everyone for participating and encourage you to watch the recording again and then come back for more USAID Global Education Learning Series events. Thanks very much.